She refused to sign. She chose hunger over surrender. For 8 years she fought alone, homeless, struggling, watching her daughter suffer. Then the world discovered what a billionaire had done to silence her. And suddenly, everything changed. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The marble floors of Whitmore Industries gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting as Victoria Chen walked through the executive corridor on a Tuesday morning in March. At 34 years old, with her dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and her tailored navy suit perfectly pressed, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every promotion through sheer determination and intellect. Behind her, struggling to keep pace, was her 7-year-old daughter Maya, holding her mother's hand tightly. Victoria had brought Maya to the office because it was spring break, and her usual childcare had fallen through at the last minute. The CEO's assistant had assured her it would be fine, just for the day. They were walking toward a meeting that Victoria didn't yet know would change everything. The corner office belonged to James Whitmore, 68 years old, and one of the most powerful men in the country. His net worth exceeded $15 billion. His influence stretched across industries from technology to real estate to pharmaceuticals. He was also, as Victoria was about to discover, a man willing to do absolutely anything to get what he wanted. When his secretary ushered Victoria and Maya inside, James sat behind a desk the size of a small car, reviewing documents through reading glasses that made his pale blue eyes seem magnified and cold. He looked up slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, which in a sense he did. "Victoria Chen," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Come in. Sit down." He gestured to the leather chair across from him without acknowledging Maya's presence. Maya pressed closer to her mother, sensing something off about the man's energy. The office smelled of expensive cologne and old money, the kind of space where power was so concentrated it seemed to have its own weight. Victoria sat carefully, keeping Maya beside her. She had worked at Whitmore Industries for 6 years, starting as a junior analyst and working her way up to senior financial strategist. She had never been called into James Whitmore's office before. There had been no warning, no email suggesting the topic of conversation. Her heart was already beginning to race with the kind of anxiety that comes from the unknown. "I've been watching you," James said, removing his glasses and setting them on the desk in front of him. "Your work ethic is extraordinary. Your mind is sharp. You've contributed immensely to the success of this company over the past 6 years." Victoria opened her mouth to thank him, but he held up a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "However," James continued, "I'm not going to waste time on pleasantries. Life is too short for that, especially at my age. I have a proposition for you, and I want you to listen very carefully before you respond." He paused, letting the weight of anticipation fill the room. "I'm 70 years old in October," he said. "I have no children of my own. My ex-wives have taken enough from me over the years that I've decided I'm not interested in another marriage, but I do have one significant problem that has become increasingly important to me as I've grown older. I have no heir." Victoria still didn't understand what this had to do with her. Maya was fidgeting in her seat, swinging her legs back and forth. Victoria placed a gentle hand on her daughter's knee to settle her. James watched this interaction with what seemed like clinical interest. "Your daughter is beautiful," he said. "How old is she?" 7, Victoria replied carefully. 7 years old and already showing signs of intelligence. I can see it in her eyes." The comment made Victoria deeply uncomfortable. She straightened slightly in her chair. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not sure why my daughter being here is relevant to our meeting, but if this isn't about work performance or my position at the company, I'm not sure this conversation is appropriate." James leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Relax," he said. "I'm not a monster, whatever you might be thinking. I simply want to present you with an opportunity." He stood and walked to the large window behind his desk, which overlooked the entire city. The view was supposed to be impressive. From this height, Victoria could see the sprawl of downtown, the way the city seemed to bend to the will of the powerful people in buildings like this one. "Here's what I'm going to propose," James continued, keeping his back to her. "I will adopt your daughter, Maya, legally, completely. I will make her my sole heir. When I die, she will inherit everything. The Whitmore fortune, the company, all of my assets. She will be set for life, Victoria. More than set. She will be powerful. She will never want for anything. She will never struggle the way you have struggled. She will never have to work in an office, taking direction from men like me if she doesn't want to. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. I don't understand, she said quietly. Are you asking me to give up my daughter? That's not an opportunity. That's not a proposition. That's asking me to abandon my child. James turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. I'm asking you to give her a better life than you could ever provide, he said coldly. Think about it, Victoria. You're a single mother making 6 figures, which sounds impressive until you do the math. You're living in a small apartment in the city. You're working 60-hour weeks just to cover rent and childcare and food. You're exhausted. You're burning out. I can see it in your face. Your daughter spends more time with babysitters than with you. She goes to an underfunded public school when she could go to the finest private institutions in the world. She eats chicken nuggets and store-brand cereal, because it's what you can afford while working for me. I'm offering her a life of genuine privilege and security. No, Victoria said firmly, standing up. Absolutely not. Come on, Maya. We're leaving. She reached for her daughter's hand, but James's next words stopped her cold. I'm not finished, he said, and I strongly suggest you hear me out before you make any hasty decisions. Victoria turned back to him slowly, her protective instincts warring with her need to understand exactly what kind of threat this man was making. What else could you possibly have to say? She asked, her voice low and dangerous. She had never spoken to James Whitmore with anything less than total respect before, but that was before he had suggested taking her daughter away from her. James returned to his desk and pressed a button. Within moments, his assistant entered with a file folder, which James tossed across the desk. Open it, he instructed. Victoria hesitated but complied. Inside were photographs, images of her apartment, images of her and Maya at the grocery store, images of them walking home from school. Some appeared to be recent, taken within the past week. The violation of it, the sheer invasion of privacy, made her feel nauseous. James smiled at her reaction. I know everything about you, Victoria. I know you work here. I know you live on 5th and Maple, apartment 412. I know you buy your groceries from the discount market on Thursdays because they give you an extra 10% discount with your shopper's card. I know Maya attends Lincoln Elementary School. I know her teacher's name is Mrs. Ramirez. I know she loves strawberry jam but won't eat crusts on her bread. I know everything. Why are you doing this? Victoria whispered, her voice shaking. Because I can, James replied simply, and because I want something. And you're in a position to give it to me. Here's my final offer. You sign the adoption papers. You voluntarily relinquish all parental rights to Maya. She becomes my legal daughter and my heir. In return, I will ensure you are taken care of financially. I'll set up a trust fund for you, $10 million. More than enough to retire tomorrow if you choose. You can do whatever you want with your life. Travel, study, write a book, start a business, live quietly somewhere peaceful. The choice becomes yours. All you have to do is sign some papers and walk away. And if I refuse? Victoria asked, though she was already beginning to understand the answer. James's expression hardened. Then I will destroy you, he said without any inflection in his voice. I will ensure you are fired from Whitmore Industries. I will make sure no other major company in this city will touch you. I will spread rumors about your competence, your stability, your fitness as a mother. I will make sure that social services opens an investigation into your living situation, your finances, your ability to provide for a child. I will tie you up in legal battles that will cost you everything you have. I will make your life a living hell, Victoria. And when I'm done, I will take your daughter anyway. The courts will award custody to me because I can afford the best lawyers in the world, and you will have been destroyed in the process. Victoria's hands were shaking. She was trying to process what James was saying, trying to understand if this was really happening or if she was having some kind of stress-induced episode. This can't be legal, she said. You can't just threaten someone like this. Can I? James asked, his tone almost amused. "Try going to the police. Tell them a billionaire threatened to adopt your daughter and financially ruin you. See what they do? They will do nothing. They will tell you that no crime has been committed. I haven't threatened violence. I haven't made any specific illegal action. I've simply explained to you the consequences of refusing a generous offer. That's not illegal. That's business. That's leverage." He walked around the desk and stood directly in front of her, invading her personal space in a way that was deliberately intimidating. "You have 48 hours to make a decision," he said. "Either you sign the papers and take the money and disappear from both mine and Maya's life, or you refuse and watch everything you've built burn to the ground. After which, I'll take her from you anyway. So you can choose between a comfortable retirement and a lifetime of struggle with nothing to show for it. Either way, by the end of this month, Maya Whitmore will be my daughter. The only variable is whether you benefit from it or not." Victoria grabbed Maya's hand and left the office without another word. She walked through the corridors of Whitmore Industries in a daze, barely aware of the employees passing by, barely aware of the elevator descent to the ground floor. She got Maya into the car and drove, not to their apartment, but to a park. A quiet park where they could sit on a bench and she could try to gather her thoughts. Maya, sensing something was deeply wrong, pressed against her mother without speaking. They sat there for hours, watching the sun move across the sky, until Victoria had to make a choice. She thought about what James had said. $10 million. She could give Maya a good life with that money. She could buy a house somewhere else, far away from here. She could give Maya the life she deserved. All she had to do was sign a paper saying she didn't want to be her mother anymore. The logic of it was almost seductive. Then she looked down at Maya's small face, her daughter, who was part of her, who had her eyes, who had come into the world because Victoria had wanted her with every fiber of her being. She thought about all the nights she had worked late so Maya could have piano lessons, all the times she had skipped meals to ensure Maya had healthy food to eat, all the sacrifices she had made because being a mother wasn't a transaction. It was a commitment. That evening, Victoria went to see a lawyer. She couldn't afford the most expensive firm in the city, but she found a woman named Sarah Mitchell who specialized in family law and was willing to consult with her at a reduced rate. Victoria explained the situation without all the details, just the basics. James Whitmore was pressuring her to voluntarily give up custody of her daughter in exchange for money. Sarah's face went pale as she listened. "What he's describing is coercion," Sarah said. "What he's describing is potentially illegal, depending on how it plays out. But here's the problem. Proving it will be difficult. A verbal threat without witnesses is hard to prosecute. And even if you go to the police, they may not take action. Whitmore has resources that you can't compete with in a direct legal battle." The words Victoria feared most. She couldn't compete. That was the entire point. James had chosen her precisely because she couldn't compete, because she was a single mother without family wealth, without powerful connections, without the resources to fight back. She was exactly the kind of person who could be threatened with impunity. If you refuse, and he follows through on his threats, you'll need someone to help you navigate it. But I have to be honest with you. If he's as powerful as you say he is, the deck will be stacked against you. My advice would be to refuse him, document everything, and prepare for a fight. But I also understand if you're frightened. Most people would be. Victoria left Sarah's office more confused than ever. She thought about calling someone for advice. Her mother had passed away 5 years ago. She had no siblings. She had friends, but none of them would know how to handle a situation this extreme. This wasn't a normal problem. This was a test of character unlike anything she had ever faced, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to pass it. She spent the night awake, sitting in the dark of her apartment, listening to Maya sleep in the next room. She thought about the choice James had given her: comfort or integrity, money or motherhood, security or love. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She called James Whitmore's office and requested a meeting. The secretary, who was clearly in on whatever this was, scheduled her for 10 o'clock that morning. Victoria took Maya to school, kissed her goodbye, and drove to Whitmore Industries for the last time. In his office, James was waiting with adoption papers already prepared on his desk, as if he had never doubted that she would come. He was smiling, confident in his victory. "I've decided," Victoria said quietly. "I'm not signing the papers. I'm not giving you my daughter. I'm not taking your money. Whatever happens next, I'm choosing her. I'm choosing to fight." James's smile faded. He stood slowly, and for a moment Victoria saw what real anger looked like on his face. "Very well," he said coldly. "You've made your choice. Now you will live with the consequences." He pressed the button on his phone. "Have Victoria Chen removed from the building," he instructed his assistant. "Effective immediately, her employment with Whitmore Industries is terminated. Ensure security escorts her from the premises. Then contact our PR team. I want a narrative started about her incompetence. I want her name attached to failed projects. I want whispers in the industry that she's mentally unstable and unreliable. By the end of the week, I want every major company in this city to know not to hire her." Victoria stood there, listening to her professional life being dismantled in real time. She thought about the irony. She had refused to sign away her motherhood to save her career, and now her career was being destroyed anyway. But Maya was still hers. That was what mattered. Security arrived within minutes and escorted her from the building. She wasn't allowed to return to her desk to gather her personal belongings. Everything she had worked for over 6 years was simply boxed up and delivered to her apartment later that week, along with a severance check that was insulting in its smallness. The next few weeks were chaos. Victoria applied for jobs, but James had been true to his word. Within days, every company that had seemed interested suddenly wasn't. The ones that bothered to give her feedback mentioned vague concerns about her reliability. One interviewer actually asked if she had experienced mental health crises. She realized James had gotten to them, had poisoned every well she tried to drink from. She burned through her savings quickly. Rent was due, utilities needed to be paid, food had to be bought. Maya's school fees, while modest, suddenly seemed impossible to manage. She took a job at a coffee shop for minimum wage, working nights and mornings to make ends meet. Maya went to after-school care, then to a neighbor's house, then to any place Victoria could afford to have her watched while she worked. The life they had built was collapsing, exactly as James had promised it would. Victoria would lie awake at night, listening to the sounds of the city outside her apartment, feeling the weight of her choice. She had refused to trade her daughter for comfort. But now she was watching that daughter go hungry some nights, watching her wear clothes that were too small because Victoria couldn't afford new ones, watching her worry about things no 7-year-old should worry about. 4 months after she had been fired, Victoria's eviction notice came. She had missed 2 months of rent. The landlord, clearly instructed by someone with money and reach, refused to negotiate. She had 30 days to leave. Victoria sat on the floor of her apartment and allowed herself exactly 1 hour to fall apart. She cried until she couldn't cry anymore. Then she stood up, washed her face, and began making phone calls. She found a shelter that could take her and Maya. She packed what little they had left. The life she had built, the career she had carefully constructed, the home they had made, was gone. The shelter was crowded and loud and smelled of too many people in too small a space. Maya, who had never known deprivation in her life, was terrified. She clung to her mother at night, asking over and over if they would be okay. Victoria promised her they would be, knowing she was lying, knowing she had no idea if they would ever be okay again. She worked at the coffee shop during the day and at a convenience store at night. She made barely enough to keep them fed. The shelter provided a bed and a roof, but everything else was up to her. She was managing barely to keep them from falling deeper into the abyss. One evening, about 6 months after she had refused James Whitmore's offer, a man in an expensive suit appeared at the shelter and asked to speak with her. Victoria's heart stopped. She thought James was finally following through on his threat to take Maya through legal channels. She went with the man to an office in the shelter where he introduced himself as Thomas Berkeley, an attorney. He explained, in careful, deliberate language, that James Whitmore had filed for custody of Maya in family court. He had claimed that Victoria was unfit as a mother, that she was homeless, that she was unable to provide for her daughter's basic needs. He had presented documentation of her eviction, her job loss, her financial insolvency. He was asking the court to place Maya in his legal guardianship, citing her best interests, Victoria felt the floor tilt beneath her. This was it. This was the final step of his plan. He had destroyed her career and her home, had forced her into poverty, and now he was using that poverty as evidence that she wasn't fit to be a mother. It was diabolic in its logic. It was perfect. No judge would look at her current circumstances and think she was capable of raising a child. And James, by contrast, could offer security, education, opportunity, and wealth. From any objective standpoint, Maya would be better off with him. But Victoria knew something that no judge could understand. She knew that living under James Whitmore's roof would be a form of prison for her daughter, that she would be raised as an heir, not as a child, that her entire identity would become defined by her inheritance rather than by who she was as a person. Thomas Berkeley explained the legal options available to her, but they all required money that Victoria didn't have. They all required lawyers she couldn't afford, and court appearances she could barely manage between her two jobs. She had a hearing scheduled for a week away, and she had no idea how she was going to fight this. That evening, Victoria walked to the public library and used a computer to search for James Whitmore. She found articles about him, interviews where he discussed his business philosophy. She read about his company and his investments and his philanthropic endeavors. She found photographs of him at galas and charity events, always surrounded by beautiful people, always smiling, always confident. And then she found something else. A blog post from 15 years ago. A woman named Diane Richardson had written about her experience working for James Whitmore. She had accused him of sexual harassment. She had written about how he had pressured her to have an affair with him, threatening her job if she refused. She had described how, when she had finally reported him to Human Resources, the complaint had simply disappeared. The post had dozens of comments from other women with similar stories, but there was nothing recent. No lawsuits, no prosecutions, no consequences. James had simply continued on, amassing more power, more wealth, more ability to do whatever he wanted without accountability. Victoria printed out the post and read it multiple times. She understood now that James Whitmore was a predator. He had chosen her not because he actually wanted to be a father, but because he had wanted to exert power over her, to see if he could break her, to watch her choose between her motherhood and her survival. When she had refused him, he had decided to take her daughter anyway, not out of any desire to father her, but out of pure spite, to punish Victoria for not obeying him, to prove that his wealth made him untouchable. The court hearing came on a Tuesday morning. Victoria wore the best clothes she owned, which were the same clothes she had worn to work at Whitmore Industries months ago. They were slightly frayed now, and she had tried unsuccessfully to hide a small stain on the cuff with her hand. She sat in the courtroom across from James, who was wearing a suit that probably cost more than she made in a month. His lawyer was a sharp woman named Margaret Connors, who had argued dozens of custody cases and won most of them. Victoria's lawyer was Thomas Berkeley, who was doing this pro bono out of some sense of justice, but who had never had to fight against someone with James's resources before. The judge was a man in his 60s named Raymond Chen. He reviewed the case files, read the documents that James's team had prepared, which painted Victoria as a negligent mother living in homeless shelters, unable to provide for her daughter. Then Thomas Berkeley stood and asked if he could make a statement. He explained Victoria's situation, explained that she was working 2 jobs, explained that she was doing everything in her power to care for her daughter despite the circumstances. He explained that James Whitmore had deliberately sabotaged her career and her housing situation in order to create the very circumstances he was now using as evidence of her unfitness. Judge Chen looked at Victoria. "Is this true?" he asked, "that Mr. Whitmore sabotaged your employment?" Victoria nodded. "I worked for Whitmore Industries for 6 years, without a single complaint about my performance. I was fired without cause when I refused a personal request from Mr. Whitmore." The judge turned to James. "Is that accurate?" James, through his lawyer, explained that Victoria had been let go due to performance issues unrelated to her personal interactions with him, that he barely knew her and certainly had no personal dispute with her, that he simply felt compelled to step in on behalf of a child who was living in poverty. Judge Chen reviewed the evidence again. He looked at the photographs of Victoria's apartment before the eviction, the bank statements showing her employment history, the performance reviews from her previous jobs. He looked at Maya, who was sitting in the gallery with a social worker assigned to the case. Then he made his decision. Given Victoria's current circumstances and her inability to provide stable housing and adequate resources, and given Mr. Whitmore's demonstrated capacity and willingness to provide those things, I am recommending that custody be transferred to Mr. Whitmore, pending a 6-month evaluation period. Victoria felt her entire world collapse. This was it. She had lost. James had won. Her daughter would be taken from her. But then Thomas Berkeley stood again. Your Honor, I'd like to request a 30-day continuance. I have additional evidence I'd like to present to the court that I believe is relevant to this case. Judge Chen was intrigued. What kind of evidence? Thomas asked for permission to investigate James Whitmore's background, his financial records, his personal history. He wanted time to determine if there were any patterns of predatory behavior that should factor into the custody decision. Margaret Connors objected immediately, claiming it was a fishing expedition and a waste of the court's time. But Judge Chen, something in his expression suggesting he had seen something in James's demeanor that bothered him, allowed the continuance. Victoria left the courthouse feeling like she had been given a reprieve, not a victory. 30 days. That was how much time Thomas had to find something, anything, that would convince Judge Chen not to hand her daughter over to James Whitmore. Victoria didn't believe it was possible. James had been too careful. He had too many resources. He had already demonstrated his ability to make problems disappear. But she had to try. During those 30 days, Victoria cooperated fully with Thomas's investigation. She gave him access to her phone records, her emails, anything that might prove that James had orchestrated her downfall. She sat for interviews where she recounted every detail of her conversations with him. Thomas dug into James's financial records and discovered something interesting. There was a pattern of large payments going to various women over the years. Payments that looked suspiciously like settlements. When Thomas subpoenaed the recipients to ask if they had experienced harassment from James Whitmore, most of them either refused to speak or had moved away and were hard to locate. But one woman, a former executive named Patricia Donovan, agreed to an interview. She described in detail how James had sexually harassed her, how she had been forced to leave the company after rejecting his advances, and how he had paid her a substantial settlement to keep quiet about it. Thomas also discovered that James had gone through a bitter custody battle 20 years ago with an ex-girlfriend who had claimed he was abusive. The case had been settled quietly, and all the records had been sealed. But Thomas managed to find a retired judge who remembered the case and was willing to testify that the allegations had been serious enough that the judge had initially wanted to deny James any custody of his biological child, though money and lawyers had eventually turned the tide. 1 week before the continued hearing, Thomas presented all of this to Victoria. He also presented something else. He had found a recording, an audio file from 5 years ago of a conversation between James Whitmore and one of his executives. In the recording, James was discussing his philosophy on power and control. He said that people were nothing but resources to be managed, that most people could be broken if you applied enough pressure, that sentiment and emotion were weaknesses to be exploited, that the world belonged to those willing to do whatever it took to take it. This is probably inadmissible, Thomas admitted. It's not directly relevant to your case, and the legality of how I obtained it is questionable. But it shows a pattern. It shows his mindset, and it might convince the judge to look more carefully at everything else. The morning of the second hearing, Victoria sat once again in the courtroom across from James. This time, Thomas Berkeley had prepared a different kind of presentation. He called Patricia Donovan to testify about her experience with James. He called the retired judge to discuss the sealed custody case from 20 years ago. He presented the financial records showing the pattern of settlements, and then he played the recording of James discussing his philosophy on control and power. And Margaret Connors objected repeatedly, claiming that none of this was relevant to Victoria's fitness as a mother. She was right, in a technical sense. None of it proved that Victoria was a good mother, but it proved something else. It proved that James Whitmore was not a trustworthy custodian. It proved that his motivations in seeking custody were suspect. It proved that he had a history of using his resources to silence and intimidate women. It proved that his interest in Maya was not parental but predatory. Judge Chen listened to all of it carefully. When the testimony was finished, he took a 30-minute recess and returned with his decision. He was denying James Whitmore's petition for custody. He was also initiating a state investigation into James's business practices and his history with women, based on the evidence presented. He ordered that Victoria retain full custody of her daughter, pending the social workers' continued monitoring of their situation. He further ordered that James Whitmore was not to approach, contact, or attempt to interact with Victoria or Maya in any way, or he would face contempt of court charges. Victoria felt the tears come, not in relief at first, but in shock. She had actually won. Against all odds, against his resources and his power and his connections, she had won. But James's expression was darker than anything she had ever seen. He stood up slowly, and even from across the courtroom, Victoria could feel the venom in his gaze. "This isn't over," he mouthed silently. She understood exactly what he meant. This was only a temporary victory. James Whitmore didn't accept defeat. He never had. The social workers' monitoring continued for another 6 months, during which Victoria slowly began to rebuild her life. Thomas Berkeley helped her find a job at a non-profit organization that worked with underprivileged families. The pay was less than she had made before, but it was honest work, and more importantly, nobody there cared about her connection to James Whitmore. She found an affordable apartment in a different part of the city. She and Maya moved out of the shelter into their own space. It was small and in a rough neighborhood, but it was theirs. She enrolled Maya in a good public school. She began slowly to put her life back together, but she was always looking over her shoulder. She knew James hadn't given up. She knew that a man like that didn't simply accept loss and move on. She just didn't know what form his revenge would take. Years passed. Victoria got a promotion at the non-profit and began making more money. Maya grew. She was no longer a terrified 7-year-old, but a confident, intelligent teenager. Victoria had rebuilt enough of her career that she was able to move them to a better apartment, to give Maya opportunities she had denied her before, to slowly climb back toward the life they had lost. And then, 8 years after the courtroom victory, Victoria received a phone call from a news station. A journalist was working on a story about James Whitmore. Over the past several years, multiple women had come forward with allegations against him. The sealed custody case from 20 years ago had been reopened. His company was facing several investigations for financial irregularities. The recording that Thomas Berkeley had used in court had somehow been leaked to the press, and now the recording was going viral. Suddenly, James Whitmore's past was becoming very public. The journalist wanted to interview Victoria. She wanted to know about the custody battle and the coercion and the threats. She wanted to understand how Victoria had managed to stand up to one of the most powerful men in the country. Victoria agreed to the interview. She thought about her answer for a long time before she gave it. She thought about the 8 years of struggle, of working 2 jobs, of living in a shelter, of refusing to trade her integrity for comfort. She thought about Maya, who had grown up knowing that her mother loved her more than security, more than money, more than survival itself. And she thought about James Whitmore, who had built an empire on the idea that everyone could be broken if you applied enough pressure, only to discover that he had been wrong about Victoria Chen. The interview aired on a Sunday evening during prime time. By Monday morning, Victoria's phone was ringing constantly. Law firms wanted to know if she would join a class action lawsuit against James Whitmore. Former employees of his company wanted her to tell her story to investigators. The world wanted to know who she was. But more importantly, James Whitmore wanted to know something too. He wanted to know what it felt like to lose. He wanted to know what it was like when the world finally saw him the way Victoria had always seen him. He wanted to know what it meant to be held accountable. As Victoria watched her daughter graduate from high school with honors, as she watched her pursue a college education that would have been impossible in James Whitmore's world, as she watched her become the strong, independent woman she was always meant to be, Victoria understood something fundamental about power and control. True power wasn't in the ability to threaten or coerce or intimidate. True power was in the ability to refuse. True power was in choosing love over security, integrity over comfort, motherhood over money. True power was in standing up to a billionaire and saying no, and meaning it, and being willing to suffer the consequences because you knew that some things were worth suffering for. 8 years after the courtroom victory, justice was finally catching up with James Whitmore. His company was in free fall. His reputation was destroyed. Women were coming forward by the dozens. Lawsuits were being filed. Investigations were being opened. And it had all started with one woman who had refused to sign adoption papers when presented with hunger as the alternative. Victoria Chen had done what everyone said was impossible. She had beaten a billionaire at his own game. And more importantly, she had kept her daughter. That victory, the fallout from Victoria's interview was swift and comprehensive. Within a week, 3 major news outlets had picked up her story. Within 2 weeks, it had gone national. By the end of the month, James Whitmore was the most vilified man in America. The narrative that had once been buried under layers of legal settlements and confidentiality agreements was now front and center on every news network, every social media platform, every dinner table conversation across the country. People who had once envied James Whitmore's wealth and power now felt only revulsion at what that power had been used for. The recording of him discussing his philosophy on breaking people became the defining image of who he really was, not the philanthropic businessman he had pretended to be. The first casualty was his company. The board of directors, terrified of the liability and the public relations nightmare, called an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to force James's resignation as CEO. He fought it, of course, with every lawyer and every threat at his disposal. But the dam had already broken. Shareholders were withdrawing investments. Major clients were pulling contracts. Employees were leaving en masse. The empire that James had spent 50 years building began to crumble in the span of weeks. His net worth, which had been $15 billion just months earlier, started hemorrhaging billions as the company's stock price collapsed. Every scandal bred more scandals. Every lawsuit brought more women forward. Every investigation revealed new layers of corruption and abuse that James had managed to hide for decades. But it wasn't just the company that was falling apart. The legal system, which had always seemed to work in James's favor before, was now working against him. District Attorney Patricia Morrison, a black woman who had read about Victoria's case in the news and been moved by her story, opened a formal investigation into James Whitmore's conduct. She convened a grand jury. She subpoenaed years of financial records and business communications. She interviewed dozens of women who had signed confidentiality agreements that had previously silenced them. And then, in what many legal observers called the most dramatic moment in years, she announced that she was filing charges against James Whitmore for sexual harassment, workplace discrimination, and coercion. Victoria received a phone call from District Attorney Morrison personally. She asked if Victoria would be willing to testify. Victoria agreed, without hesitation. On the day of the trial, she walked into the courthouse with her daughter at her side. Maya was 15 years old now, tall and confident, with her mother's intelligence and determination, and none of her mother's bitterness. They held hands as they climbed the courthouse steps, photographers and reporters surrounding them, calling out questions. Victoria didn't answer any of them. She just kept walking forward, kept moving toward justice, kept doing what she had always done. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Victoria testified for 2 full days, describing in detail the threats James had made, the coercion he had employed, the cold calculation with which he had attempted to destroy her life. Other women testified about similar experiences. Former employees described the toxic culture James had cultivated at his company. Emails and recordings were presented as evidence. The case against James was overwhelming. His defense team tried everything. They attempted to discredit Victoria, suggesting that she was motivated by revenge, that she was an unreliable narrator, that she had somehow orchestrated the entire situation to get media attention. But the evidence was too compelling. The pattern was too clear. The testimony was too consistent, and most damaging of all, there was James himself. He took the stand in his own defense, a decision his lawyers begged him not to make. But James was arrogant. He believed that his charm and his intellect could talk him out of anything. He believed he could manipulate the jury the same way he had manipulated so many people over the years. What he didn't understand was that the world had changed, that the power he had once wielded to silence women was no longer absolute, that his money and his connections couldn't buy him out of this one. On the stand, James Whitmore told the jury that he had simply been attracted to Victoria and had wanted to expand his family. He claimed he had never threatened her, that she was the one who had become aggressive and hostile. He suggested that her current life, her job at the nonprofit, her pride in her daughter, was all somehow less valuable than what he could have offered. He used language that revealed exactly how he thought about people. He called women resources. He described people as either winners or losers. He made it clear that he believed the strong should dominate the weak, that morality was simply an invention of people who lacked the strength to take what they wanted. By the time he finished testifying, the jury had heard him describe his own predatory behavior in his own words. They had heard him justify coercion as a business strategy. They had heard him express contempt for anyone who wouldn't bend to his will. It was his confession, delivered in that cold, calculated voice that Victoria had heard 8 years before, when he had first threatened to destroy her. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. Their verdict was guilty on all counts. James Whitmore was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, a sentence that might have seemed lenient had it not been followed by the civil lawsuits. Dozens of women filed suits against him for damages. His company, now operating under new leadership, began settling the claims. The settlement total eventually exceeded $2 billion. James Whitmore, the man who had once threatened to destroy Victoria for refusing him, was himself destroyed. Not by her, but by his own actions, by his own choices, by the world's refusal to let him continue to operate with impunity. And through it all, Victoria remained calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate publicly. She simply did what she had always done. She worked. She raised her daughter. She lived her life with integrity and purpose. She had learned long ago that revenge was a poison that destroyed the person consuming it more than the person it was aimed at. What she had instead was something more powerful than revenge. She had justice. She had vindication. She had the knowledge that she had been right all along, that she had seen James Whitmore clearly, when everyone else had been fooled by his wealth and his power. 6 months after James was sentenced, Victoria received an offer. A major foundation dedicated to supporting women in the workplace and fighting sexual harassment wanted to hire her as their executive director. The salary was triple what she had been making at the nonprofit. The work was exactly what she wanted to be doing. She would be responsible for creating programs to help women fight back against workplace abuse, to connect them with lawyers and resources, to build community and solidarity among victims. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, and Victoria accepted it without hesitation. On her first day at the foundation, Victoria walked into an office that had been designed with her in mind. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. The space was bright and welcoming and empowering. She had a team of dedicated professionals who wanted to do this work alongside her. She had access to resources that would allow her to actually make a difference on a large scale. And most importantly, she had a salary that would finally allow her to give her daughter the life she deserved. She called Maya that evening and took her out to celebrate. They went to an expensive restaurant, the kind Victoria had never been able to afford before. Maya ordered whatever she wanted without thinking about the cost. They toasted to the new beginning. And as Victoria looked at her daughter across the table, she felt something she hadn't felt in 8 years. She felt free, not just from the threat of James Whitmore, but from the weight of surviving, of struggling, of having to sacrifice everything just to keep her family together. She had survived. They had survived. And now they could actually thrive. Over the next few years, Victoria built the foundation into one of the most influential organizations of its kind. She used her platform to speak about her experience, to help other women who found themselves targeted by powerful men, to create legal frameworks and workplace policies that protected vulnerable employees. She testified before Congress about the need for stronger protections against workplace coercion. She worked with legislators to close loopholes that had allowed men like James to operate with impunity for decades. She became not just a survivor, but an advocate, a leader, a voice for women who had been silenced for too long. And then, 3 years after James had been sentenced, something happened that Victoria had not anticipated. She received a letter at the foundation office. It was handwritten on prison stationery. It was from James Whitmore. Victoria's first instinct was to throw it away, to refuse to give him any attention whatsoever. But something made her open it. Some small part of her wanted to understand what he could possibly have to say after everything that had happened. The letter was a confession of sorts. James wrote that he had spent the first months of his incarceration in denial, convinced that he had been wronged, that the system had turned against him, that Victoria was somehow responsible for his downfall. But over time, through prison counseling, through forced time alone with his own thoughts, he had begun to see himself clearly. He wrote that he understood now that he had been a predator, that his entire life had been built on the abuse of power, that he had convinced himself that his wealth and intelligence gave him the right to take whatever he wanted from whoever he wanted. He wrote that he was deeply sorry, not because he had been caught, but because he finally understood the harm he had caused. Victoria read the letter twice. She felt nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, no sense that James's repentance meant anything. His apology didn't change the 8 years of struggle she had endured. It didn't give back the career she had lost, or the home, or the security, or the peace of mind. She understood that his words were just words, and that some things, once broken, could never be fully repaired. But she also understood that his letter represented one small thing. It represented an acknowledgement. It represented a crack in the armor of denial that had always protected him. It represented the possibility that even a man like James Whitmore could eventually see himself clearly. She filed the letter away in a safe place, not because she wanted to keep it close, but because it might be useful someday, if another survivor needed proof that even the most powerful men could eventually be held accountable. And then she went back to her work, back to helping other women, back to building a world where women like her didn't have to choose between motherhood and survival, between integrity and security, between love and power. 5 years after the trial, Victoria stood on the stage of a major conference dedicated to workplace rights and women's empowerment. She was being presented with an award for her advocacy work. Behind her, on a large screen, was an image of her and Maya, taken just that morning. Maya was now 20 years old, in her second year of college, studying law with the intention of specializing in workplace rights and discrimination cases. She wanted to follow in the footsteps of Thomas Berkeley and others who had fought for her mother. She wanted to dedicate her life to ensuring that women like Victoria Chen didn't have to fight alone. As Victoria accepted the award, she thought about the 8-year-old girl who had been at the center of this entire story. Maya had grown up watching her mother refuse to compromise, refuse to be broken, refuse to trade her integrity for comfort. She had learned by example what it meant to have principles and the courage to stand by them. She had learned that love was worth fighting for, that motherhood was sacred, that some things were more important than survival. And now she wanted to give to other families what her mother had fought so hard to protect. Victoria used her acceptance speech to tell her story. She told the audience about the 48-hour ultimatum. She told them about the homeless shelter. She told them about the courtroom victory and the 8 years that followed. She told them about the moment when everything changed, when the world finally saw James Whitmore the way she had always seen him. And then she said something that made many people in the audience cry. "I was given a choice 8 years ago," Victoria said, her voice steady and powerful. "I could sign adoption papers and take the money and disappear from my daughter's life. Or I could refuse and watch everything be taken from me. Many people have asked me since then if I regret my choice. And I want to be very clear. I have never, not for a single moment, regretted choosing my daughter. Because she is not an asset. She is not something to be traded or negotiated or leveraged. She is a human being, and I am her mother, and that relationship is sacred. I refuse to let a billionaire take that from me because I knew something he never understood. True power isn't in money or influence or the ability to threaten people. True power is in love. True power is in standing up and saying no, even when it costs you everything, because you know that some things are worth suffering for." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. By the time it ended, Victoria had tears streaming down her face. Not because she was sad, but because she was finally, truly free. Free from the weight of that choice. Free from the fear that had followed her for so many years. Free from the need to constantly prove that she had done the right thing. She had done the right thing. The world now knew it. And more importantly, she knew it. And her daughter knew it. Later that evening, Victoria took Maya to dinner to celebrate both the award and her 21st birthday, which had fallen on the same day. They sat at an elegant restaurant overlooking the same city where everything had happened. where James had threatened her, where she had struggled to survive, where she had eventually rebuilt her life. Maya raised her glass. "I want to make a toast," Maya said, her voice filled with emotion. "To my mom. To the strongest person I've ever known. You chose me when you could have chosen comfort. You chose love when you could have chosen money. You chose integrity when you could have chosen survival. And because of that choice, I grew up knowing that I was loved more than anything in the world. And that made me strong enough to want to help other people. So I want to dedicate my law degree, and my career, to continuing what you started. To making sure that other mothers don't have to make the choice you made. To making sure that predators like Whitmore are held accountable before they can destroy families." They clinked glasses, and Victoria felt something shift inside her. This was the true victory. Not the trial. Not the conviction. Not the award. The true victory was that her daughter had grown up knowing that love was the most powerful force in the world. That integrity mattered more than money. That refusing to be broken was a form of strength that no amount of wealth could buy. That James Whitmore had been wrong about everything, but most of all, he had been wrong about Victoria Chen. A year later, Victoria received word that James Whitmore had been released from prison on parole. He had served his 5-year sentence and was being let back into society with certain restrictions and conditions. The news made her pause for just a moment. She thought about tracking what he was doing, about worrying that he might try to exact some kind of revenge. And then she realized something fundamental. She didn't care what James Whitmore did anymore. He no longer had power over her. He had no ability to hurt her, to threaten her, to control her in any way. He was simply a man, diminished and limited, and stripped of the resources that had once given him the illusion of power. She had moved on. She had built a life that was infinitely richer and more meaningful than the one she would have had if she had taken his money and disappeared. She had a daughter who was changing the world. She had a career where she was helping thousands of women fight back against abuse and harassment. She had friends and colleagues who respected her and loved her. She had integrity and purpose, and the knowledge that she had done the right thing, even when it cost her everything. 2 years after James's release from prison, Victoria was invited to give the keynote address at a major women's conference. She stood before an audience of 5,000 women, many of them survivors of workplace harassment and abuse, many of them advocates and activists and lawyers fighting for change. She told her story once again, but this time with the full weight of victory behind it. She spoke about the power of refusal. She spoke about the importance of standing together. She spoke about the way that truth eventually finds its way into the light, no matter how hard people try to suppress it. And she spoke about her daughter, about the pride she felt watching Maya graduate at the top of her law school class, about the joy she experienced when Maya passed the bar exam on her first attempt, about the hope she had for the future, knowing that her daughter was going into the world with a mission to protect other families, to prevent other women from having to make the choice that Victoria had made. In the audience that day was a woman named Sarah Martinez. She had come to the conference because she too was facing a situation with a powerful man who was threatening to take her children away, unless she agreed to his demands. She was terrified. She believed she was alone. But listening to Victoria's story, listening to the way Victoria described the choice between integrity and security, between motherhood and survival, Sarah found the courage she needed. After Victoria's speech, Sarah approached her. "Thank you," Sarah said simply. "I came here today not knowing what I was going to do. I was thinking about giving in, about making a deal with the devil, because I thought it was the only way to protect my children. But listening to you, I realized something. If I give up now, if I compromise my integrity to this man, what am I teaching my children about themselves? What am I teaching them about what's possible? You've given me the courage to fight." Victoria took Sarah's hands. "You're going to be okay," she said. "It's going to be hard. There are going to be moments when you doubt yourself. But you have to remember that you're not fighting alone. There are resources. There are lawyers. There are organizations like the one I work with that exist specifically to help women in your situation. And most importantly, you have yourself. You have your love for your children. You have your integrity. And that's more powerful than any amount of money or any threats that man can make." Over the course of the next year, Victoria worked closely with Sarah and her legal team. Together, they built a case against Sarah's abuser. They uncovered evidence of his threats and his coercion. They found other women he had targeted. And eventually, Sarah won. She retained custody of her children. The man was convicted of abuse and coercion, and Sarah's children grew up knowing that their mother had chosen them, had fought for them, had refused to be broken by someone trying to use money and power to control her. This became a pattern. Victoria's work at the foundation, combined with her visibility as a survivor, made her a beacon for other women facing similar situations. She helped dozens of them. She saw the pattern repeated again and again. Powerful men using money and resources to try to control women, to bend them to their will, to prove that wealth was the ultimate power. And again, she saw women refuse. She saw them fight. She saw them win. Not because they had more money or more resources, but because they had something more valuable. They had integrity. They had love. They had the refusal to be broken. 10 years after the first trial, Victoria was honored as one of the 50 most influential women in America. The magazine that had named her wrote a profile that traced her journey from that fateful day in James Whitmore's office to her current position as one of the leading advocates for women's rights in the country. The article ended with a quote from Maya, now a practicing lawyer with her own advocacy organization, dedicated to helping low-income women navigate family court proceedings. "My mother taught me that power isn't what you own or what you control," Maya was quoted as saying. "Power is what you're willing to defend. Power is the ability to refuse. Power is the choice to stand by your principles, even when it costs you everything." That's the lesson I want to teach the women I work with. And that's the lesson that everyone in this country needs to understand. Victoria read the article with tears in her eyes. She thought about how far she and her daughter had come. She thought about the 8-year-old girl who had been at the center of James Whitmore's attempted takeover. That girl was now an adult, a lawyer, an advocate in her own right. She had inherited her mother's strength, her determination, her refusal to accept injustice. And together, they were changing the world. Victoria never saw James Whitmore again. He lived out the remainder of his life in relative obscurity, stripped of his wealth, his influence, his power. He died 15 years after his release from prison, largely forgotten by the world that had once worshipped him. His funeral was attended by very few people. His legacy was one of predatory behavior and abuse, not innovation or philanthropy. He was remembered not for the empire he had built, but for the women he had hurt and the one woman who had refused to be hurt by him. And Victoria Chen lived on, thriving in a life she had built with her own hands, with her own choices, with her unwavering commitment to her daughter and to her principles. She eventually retired from the foundation, but remained an advisor and mentor to the next generation of advocates. She wrote a book about her experience that became a bestseller and inspired countless women to stand up and fight back. She gave speeches around the world about the power of refusal and the importance of protecting motherhood and family, and most importantly, she lived to see her daughter become a grandmother, to see her grandchildren grow up in a world that was incrementally safer, more just, more protective of women and children because of the work that she and her daughter had done. The world was far from perfect. There were still predators. There was still abuse. There was still injustice. But there was also now a blueprint for how to fight back. There was a story that showed women that they didn't have to accept threats, that they didn't have to surrender their children, that they could refuse and fight and win. 30 years after that day in James Whitmore's office, Victoria sat in her garden with her daughter and her grandchildren playing on the lawn. She thought about the choice she had made all those years ago. She thought about the 48-hour ultimatum. She thought about the shelter and the struggles and the 8 years of rebuilding. She thought about the trial and the victory and the 10 years that followed. And she thought about this moment, this perfect moment, where she was surrounded by her family, by the fruits of her refusal to be broken. If she could go back and speak to the younger version of herself, the woman sitting in that park with her daughter, terrified of making the wrong choice, Victoria would tell her something that she now knew with absolute certainty. She would tell her that choosing love over security was never the wrong choice, that standing up to power, even when you had nothing but your integrity, was always worth it. That motherhood was sacred, more sacred than any amount of money or security or comfort. That true power wasn't in the ability to threaten or coerce or control, True power was in the courage to refuse, the strength to fight, and the love that sustained you through the struggle. The world had eventually seen what Victoria had always known: that she was stronger than James Whitmore, that her love for her daughter was more powerful than his money, that her integrity was worth more than his billions. And now, with her daughter carrying on the work, with her grandchildren growing up in a world incrementally safer because of her choices, Victoria understood that her refusal to be broken had ripples that extended far beyond her own life. It extended into the lives of thousands of women she had helped. It extended into the lives of her daughter's clients. It extended into the future, into a world where fewer women would have to make the choice between motherhood and survival. That was victory. That was vindication. That was revenge, not through destruction, but through the creation of something better. And that was everything. The end.